Okay, we're going to start talking about chapters 17, 18, and 19, which are the last three chapters of the book. So chapter 17 starts with the cerebrum. Chapter 18 is the one they call cerebrum clinical applications, where they talk about the disorders. And chapter 19 is about the circulatory system, the CSF system, the support systems. So here's where I differ a little bit about from the lectures versus the way the book is arranged. When I'm talking about the cerebrum, I am going to talk about a specific structure and then the disorder that's associated with it. So in the book, they'll have the structure in chapter 17 and the disorder in chapter 18, and I have sort of smushed those together and talk about the disorder in the same place where I talk about the structure, because I feel like that's just a little bit easier way to remember it. So if you say, hey, here's what the thalamus does, and then, hey, here's what happens when there's a disorder of the thalamus, that's a little bit easier to arrange in my mind. There is tons of information in these three chapters about pathologies and about symptoms and about language disorders and psychological things. We are not going to talk about any of the psychological things because this isn't a psychology neuroscience class, even though I'm sure that would be fascinating. But we are going to talk, just as we have with all the other areas, we're talking about structures and then what happens when something goes wrong with those structures. So structures and their function, and then what goes wrong with those structures and their function. So this first part of the lecture on chapter 17 and 18, I'm just going to talk about the diencephalon. So the cerebrum itself consists of the diencephalon and the cerebral hemispheres. And the cerebral hemispheres have subcortical structures, they call them, and the cerebral cortex. So the diencephalon is everything in the cerebrum except those cerebral hemispheres and their subcortical structures. And conveniently enough to remember, the diencephalon includes all structures with the word thalamus in their names. So other areas in the diencephalon are named for their locations relative to the thalamus, not similarities of function. So they all do different things, but you know, the hypothalamus is below it and the epithalamus is around it. So they're basically, the thalamus is in the middle of the brain, and the other structures are named by their relationship, their location relative to the thalamus. So I'll just very briefly talk about their locations, and then we will go into each one. So in the module, just like I have in the PowerPoint, I'll have each structure and then the disorders associated with it. Some of the structures, the epithalamus and the subthalamus and the subcortical white matter, we're not going to necessarily talk about disorders, but they are listed in there. And there are some things like the layers of the cerebral cortex, the different types of cells. I don't want you to memorize that. I just am exposing you to it as a little tidbit of information, but that's not going to be on the test. It's not in the objectives or the study questions. It's just another little bit of information, that anatomical information. So the PowerPoint is long because it includes information from chapter 17 and chapter 18. So we're going to start with the diencephalon. It includes all of the structures with the word thalamus in their names. So the thalamus receives information from the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, all of the sensory systems, except olfactory sense, goes straight to the frontal lobe, which is interesting. I don't know why that is, but all of the senses except olfactory go to the thalamus for crude awareness. Remember those sensory tracts going, the conscious relay tracts ending in the thalamus. So other areas of the diencephalon are named for their location relative to the thalamus, not similarities of function. They all do different things. So there are all these different thalamic nuclei, and they're classified into functional groups. I don't really expect you to know the functional groups. Again, I'm just kind of exposing you to this information so you kind of have the big picture. So the three groups are relay nuclei, relay nuclei, association nuclei, and non-specific nuclei. That's the miscellaneous category, I guess. So the relay information, the relay nuclei, just like their name sounds, they convey information from the sensory systems, except olfactory, from the basal ganglia or from the cerebellum to the cerebral cortex. So that's I've talked about before, the thalamus being the executive secretary of the brain. It's passing through the information that it figures the brain needs to know about consciously. So those relay nuclei, that's really the executive secretary. The association nuclei process emotional and some memory information, or they integrate different types of sensations. So they go, okay, I'm seeing a lot of light, I'm feeling heat, things are flashing. Wait, it might be fire. Let's tell the brain about this right away. So it integrates that information and sends the whole package up to the cerebrum. So the association nuclei do that. They associate the different types of sensation and memory information and emotional information. So non-specific nuclei regulate consciousness, arousal, and attention. So there are a lot of systems in our brain. We talked about the reticular activating system in the last section. There are a lot of systems in our brain that are concerned with consciousness, arousal, and attention, because those are important parts of how we deal with life, right? So there are a lot of systems that go into that. So when you get thalamic injury, lesions that involve the relay nuclei interrupt those ascending sensory pathways, and so they compromise or eliminate sensation on the contralateral side of the body because it's already crossed over in the medulla. Remember that? So if you have a thalamic lesion in a relay nuclei area, you're going to get compromised or eliminated contralateral sensation. Proprioception, conscious proprioception, where you say, when we do the test where we say, is your arm up or down, is your finger up or down, that kind of thing. So usually that's what's most affected in that sensory information with thalamic injury. There's a rare thalamic pain syndrome that happens after damage to the thalamus that produces severe contralateral pain with or without provoking external stimuli. So that's pretty uncommon, but it does happen. So that's possible with a thalamic injury. Okay, the next part we're going to talk about is the hypothalamus. So it is named because it is underneath the thalamus. That's its name by its location, not by its function. But the hypothalamus is essential for individual survival and species survival because it integrates behaviors with visceral functions. So we sense that we're hungry, the hypothalamus makes us go and seek food. That's a survival function. So that the visceral function sends the information up there, and the hypothalamus decides what we're going to do with it. So they've done studies, and they say an animal, and a lot of the brain studies have been done with rats because rats have very similar brain structures to ours, and you can do things to them like put electrodes in their brain and stimulate certain areas and see what their behavior, what the result is. So that they electrically stimulate hypothalamic areas, and it causes an animal to search for and ingest food as long as the stimulation is applied. So as long as you're stimulating their hypothalamus, they are going to keep looking for food, and as soon as they find it, they're going to eat it. So if you have destruction bilaterally of the areas that are associated with eating behaviors, the animal's going to refuse food. And even to the point of starving to death, even when they could be sitting right next to a bowl of food and they're going to starve to death because they don't have that hypothalamic function that causes them to search for and ingest food. So it's a survival thing. Okay, so there are other functions that the hypothalamus does. It functions a lot in maintaining homeostasis, so body temperature, blood pressure, all that different stuff. Eating and reproductive and defensive behaviors. So those are all really important for survival. Emotional expression of pleasure, rage, fear, and aversion. So those are all kind of basic level emotions. They're not our high level cerebral type emotions, but those are ones that a lot of animals have. And there we are along with them with our pleasure, rage, fear, and aversion mediated by the hypothalamus. It also helps regulate circadian rhythms in concert with other brain regions. So it doesn't do it on its own, but it's part of the system that does that. And also regulation of growth, metabolism, and reproductive organs. And I'm sure you probably remember from A&P when you're talking about the endocrine system, a lot of the hormones in our body, the cascade of producing those hormones starts in the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus releases hormones that go to the thyroid to decrease or increase our metabolism. It to make us body temperature, control body temperature, make us warmer or cooler. It stimulates some of the hormones from the adrenal cortex in that's the adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidneys. So the hypothalamus is like the master gland, they'll call it sometimes, and so it's the controls the whole endocrine system, which is pretty dang cool. The epithalamus is a structure. The main part of it is the pineal gland, and it's believed to help regulate our circadian rhythms and influence the secretions of the pituitary gland, adrenal and parathyroid glands, and the islets of Langerhans, which are the cells in the pancreas that secrete insulin. So that's important for metabolism. So the epithalamus is where melatonin has its effect in sleep cycles and that sort of thing. So it works in conjunction with the hypothalamus to influence the secretions of all those different glands and control the circadian rhythms. So the subthalamus is located superior to the substantia nigra of the midbrain. So we know the midbrain is at the top of the brainstem, at the superior portion of the brainstem, and the subthalamus is just above it. Okay, it's part of the basal ganglia circuit. It's involved in regulating movement. So it's part of what it does is it facilitates output from the basal ganglia nuclei. Okay. Subcortical white matter, it's white matter, and all white matter consists of myelinated axons. That's why it's white, because myelin is high in fat. Gray matter is unmyelinated cell bodies and that sort of thing. So the subcortical white matter fibers are classified into 3 categories. And again, I'm not really going to test you on these. I'm just exposing you to the information. And we'll talk a little bit about some disorders associated with those, but that won't be on the test. So the 3 categories of subcortical white matter are projection fibers, commissural fibers, and association fibers. So that's pretty important just in how the information is communicated within the cerebrum, or within the entire cerebrum. So subcortical white matter lesions are a lot of times caused by occlusion or hemorrhage of arteries that supply the internal capsule of the cerebrum. And so small lesions, because the subcortical white matter is how the different areas of the cerebrum communicate and coordinate all this complex information, if there's even a small lesion in subcortical white matter, it can have huge effects, severe consequences on what happens in our body. So it's pretty interesting. Commissural fibers, which are some of the subcortical white matter, they connect homologous areas of the cerebral hemisphere, so connects left to right. The areas in the left that are homologous to the areas in the right hemisphere. The corpus callosum is the largest group of commissural fibers, and it links a lot of areas of the right and left hemispheres. So I'm sure in A&P or psychology class you've heard about where they do a colostomy. They cut through the corpus callosum, separating the 2 hemispheres, and it's done in cases of intractable epilepsy to slow down the excessive neuronal activity, because that's epilepsy. I've heard it compared to like an electrical storm in your brain that severs that connection, and so it can't spread to other areas of the brain, can't spread to the other hemisphere. And they only do this if the epilepsy can't be controlled by medication or by surgically cauterizing a single cortical site. So it's usually successful in preventing that excessive firing and the seizures and preventing it from spreading from one hemisphere to the other. So it limits the seizure to one hemisphere and it's less severe. So after people recover from this, they have what they call a split brain, and they can interact normally, which I think is amazing that you could do something major like that and people can still interact normally. And they can perform normally on most traditional neurologic examinations. They have some specialized tests where they have a split screen and one eye is looking at one side of the screen and one eye is looking at the other, or they do things on either side of the body where they can assess the performance of a single hemisphere. And it's kind of a neat idea. It just shows you how those fibers are so important, but you can actually have some things where they're interrupted and you can still function pretty normally. So kind of a weird little thing. So in another type of fibers in the subcortical white matter are the association fibers, and they connect cortical regions within one hemisphere. So these are shorter. They connect adjacent gyri. And the longer ones connect lobes within one hemisphere. So we'll talk a little bit, when we're talking more about the cerebrum, we'll talk about how there are different areas of the brain that are processing sensory information. And so these association fibers are what are passing that information back and forth in the different areas within a single hemisphere. So it's kind of neat. So we've talked a lot about the basal ganglia in chapter 11. But it is part of the Diencephalon, so I'm just going to briefly mention it. And we talked about it with specifically having to do with motor issues and motor control, but there are some functions that it has with attention and motivation and task changing, that sort of thing. So basal ganglia are, of course, required, or they're vital for normal motor function. They sequence movements, they regulate muscle tone and force, this should all sound familiar, and they select and inhibit specific motor synergies. So the cognitive functions that they're involved in are sustained attention, like paying attention during a 25-minute lecture, or the ability to change behavior as task requirements change. So we had the example in chapter 11 where you're on your way to a job interview and perhaps you're running a little bit late, and the light is turning from yellow to red. So you're saying, am I going to hit the brakes? Am I going to keep going? So the basal ganglia are working in that changing behavior as the task requirements change. Really important for human behavior as we know it, and motivation. How we're the cognitive function, how we're going to motivate ourselves to do different things. And a lot of the motivation things, people who lack that cognitive ability because they have dementia or some other dysfunction, it's hard to get them to do things. They need some external source of motivation because it's not coming internally. So a lot of people with Alzheimer's and some other things have that motivation issue. Basal ganglia disorders. There are certain parts of the basal ganglia that don't cause motor disorders, but they cause that apathy, the loss of initiative. That's what I was just talking about with the motivation. There's no initiative, there's no spontaneous thought or emotional response. That's the most common behavioral abnormality that is caused by caudate damage. So excessive activity of that, so damage causes the apathy and loss of initiative. Excessive activity of that circuit between the caudate and the anterior cingulate cortex and a couple of the other things is correlated with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorders. So that's almost like the opposite end of the spectrum. Excessive activity and their initiative to do all these different things, and sort of a compulsion to do different things. And apathy is the opposite. You don't have a compulsion to do anything. So interesting stuff, I think. We're going to wrap up this part of the lecture right here. just looking at the module, there are some, these are pictures from the book, of course, and sometimes they're a little bit easier to look at in the book, but they're also in the module so you can look at them. It talks about the things we've talked about. I like this graph for the hypothalamus, how it interacts with the different areas. It interacts back and forth with the limbic system, back and forth with the spinal cord, brainstem, and it stimulates the pituitary to do a lot of that endocrine function, which is pretty important just in our homeostasis and survival behaviors. There's some pictures of the different fibers in the subcortical white matter. Obviously, I don't want you to memorize them, but it's just kind of interesting to look. So you can see the projection fibers are going from one area to another, commissural fibers back and forth between the two hemispheres, association fibers within a single hemisphere. There's the picture of the cerebral cortex layers, and that's just a little bit of anatomical information that you do not need to memorize or anything. So in the next section, we're going to start talking about the cerebrum, but there's this little chart that I included in the module, areas of the diencephalon and cerebrum and their functions, and this is what I want you to know for the test. So very briefly lists the area, its location, and its function. And if you wanted to, make another chart, add another section for disorder, you could do that. Like for example, the thalamus, it's located bilaterally above the brainstem. It acts as a selective filter for the cerebral cortex. So you can just look down the line. So this information is what you need to know for the test. The chart is a great little way to study for that. Okay, so then in the next section we're going to start talking about localized functions of the cerebral cortex and disorders of those areas.